The 8,152nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. As this is the first formal meeting of the Security Council this year, I should like to extend my warm wishes on the occasion of the New Year to all members of the Security Council, the United Nations, and the Secretariat. In presiding over this first formal meeting of the Council in 2018, I'm happy to welcome the new members, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Kuwait, the Netherlands, Peru, and Poland. We look forward to their participation in the work of the Council. Their experience and wisdom will be of invaluable assistance in the discharge of the Council's responsibilities. I shall also take this opportunity to express the Council's gratitude to the outgoing members, namely Egypt, Italy, Japan, Senegal, Ukraine, and Uruguay, for their important contributions to the work of the Council during their terms. I should also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to His Excellency Mr. Koro Besho, Permanent Representative of Japan, for his service as President of the Council for the month of December 2017. I'm sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Besho and his team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Taibrook Zerihun, Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Taibrook Zerihun.
Thank you, Mr. President. As requested, I would like to brief the Security Council on ongoing developments in the Islamic Republic of Iran under the agenda item, the situation in the Middle East. As this is the first public meeting of the Security Council in 2018, I would like, on behalf of the Department of Political Affairs, to congratulate the 6 new elected members of the Council on the assumption of their important responsibilities. I also wish the Security Council a successful year. Mr. President, the protests in the Islamic Republic of Iran started on 28 December 2017 when hundreds of Iranians gathered in a largely peaceful manner in Mashhad, the country's second largest city, chanting slogans against economic hardship. Over the following days, protests occurred in other cities, other urban areas, including Tehran, as well as in many rural areas. Some of the slogans also expressed disappointment at slow or limited change in social strictures and political freedoms, and criticized what the demonstrators decried as the privileged position of the clergy and elements of the country's security establishment. In other cases, demonstrators demanded that Iran cease costly involvement in the region. As the protests escalated, some turned violent. Videos posted on social media platforms, several of which remain largely blocked by the government, and footage broadcast by state TV channels showed the beating of protesters, as well as the burning of government offices, banks, and religious centers. According to reports carried by official Iranian media, more than 20 Iranians, including a teenage boy and a policeman, have died during the protests. Iran's Ministry of Interior stated that over 1,000 protesters have been detained, although many may have since been released. With very limited presence on the ground, the Secretariat cannot confirm or deny the authenticity of the images that have been broadcast or the extent of the violence. However, we have received reports that the police, rather than the military forces, were responding to the protests. On the 3rd of January, Iran's Revolutionary Guards announced the end of anti-government protests. Recent reports indicate smaller and scattered demonstrations. Meanwhile, from the 3rd to the 5th of January, large pro-government rallies were reportedly held across the country, with participants expressing support for the Supreme Leader and condemning violence. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, on the 31st of December 2017, President Rouhani told a cabinet meeting that the Iranian people should be allowed space to protest and criticize their government. At the same time, he stressed that violence will not be tolerated. 2 days later, on the 2nd of January, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei accused Iran's enemies, without naming them, of stirring the unrest. On the 3rd of January, the permanent representative of Iran to the United Nations wrote to the Secretary General accusing the United States of stepping up, and I quote, its acts of intervention in a grotesque way in Iran's internal affairs under the pretext of providing support for sporadic protests in Iran. End of quote. Mr. President, the outbreak of violence, protests in Iran has focused the attention to events in the country. A number of world leaders have expressed support for the Iranian protesters. Others, including the European Union, have called on the Iranian authorities to respect the right to peaceful demonstration and freedom of opinion. Yet, more have supported the government of Iran, calling the protests an internal matter. On the 3rd of January, the Secretary General issued a statement deploring the loss of life in the protests and urging respect for the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, and that demonstrations take place in a peaceful manner. The same day, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called on the Iranian authorities, and I quote, to handle the wave of protests that have taken place around the country with great care so as not to further inflame violence and unrest, and to investigate all deaths and serious injuries that have occurred so far. End of quote. On the 5th of January, 4 United Nations Special Rapporteurs stated that, and I quote, the Iranian authorities should take immediate action to ensure that all citizens can exercise peacefully the right to freedom of expression and assembly, and should ensure that these and other fundamental rights are not met with violence. End of quote. Mr. President, members of the Council, as of today, United Nations development work in the Islamic Republic of Iran has not been significantly affected by the recent events. The Secretariat will continue to monitor developments on the ground and engage Iranian authorities with a view to contributing to efforts that address, as the Secretary General underscored in his statement on 3rd of January, the legitimate concerns of the population through peaceful means, and help to avoid violence or retribution against peaceful protesters. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Zerihun for his briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Happy New Year to all of the members of the Security Council and the General Assembly. In the past week, what has happened on the ground throughout the nation of Iran is something the world must take note of. It is a spontaneous expression of fundamental human rights. The Iranian people are rising up in over 79 locations throughout the country. It is a powerful exhibition of brave people who have become so fed up with their oppressive government that they're willing to risk their lives in protest. The world should applaud their courage. The voices of the Iranian people should be heard. We have debated the proper role of human rights in the Security Council. Some of our colleagues believe that human rights have no place here. They believe human rights and fundamental freedoms are the business only of the governments that control them. The United States does not share that belief. Human rights are not the gift of governments. They are the inalienable right of the people themselves. Freedom and human dignity cannot be separated from peace and security. When the rights of the people are denied, the people rightly resist. If the concerns are not acknowledged, then peace and security are inevitably threatened. We have seen that repeatedly throughout human history. The case of Syria provides a horrible recent testament to this fact. And what is happening in the towns and cities across Iran right now bears out this fundamental truth. The Iranian regime's contempt for the rights of its people has been widely documented for many years. The people of Iran have finally had enough, and they are showing it by taking to the streets. The Iranian people understand the nature of their regime. They understand that their lack of voice in their government has allowed the regime to ignore them, and it has allowed the regime to spread conflict and instability far and wide. If you listen to the slogans they chant in the street, this understanding comes through loud and clear. The United Nations reports that the Iranian regime spends at least $6 billion every year propping up the murderous Assad regime in Syria. The people of Iran know this, and so they are telling the government, quote, "Let go of Syria, think of us." The Iranian regime spends millions on militias in Iraq each year. It gives millions more each year to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, including sending them ballistic missiles to fire at other countries. Meanwhile, the average Iranian family is 15% poorer today than it was 10 years ago. So the Iranian people demand, think of us. The regime gives low-interest loans to the elite and well-connected. It rewards construction contracts to corrupt Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps affiliated firms. They construct buildings that skimp on safety. Thousands of these buildings collapsed during an earthquake. Hundreds died. And the Iranian people chant, think of us. Today, the people of Iran are speaking to their government, and their message is undeniable. Stop the support for terrorism. Stop giving billions of our money to killers and dictators. Stop taking our wealth and spending it on foreign fighters and proxy wars. Think of us. Freedom-loving nations worldwide have spread support for the cause of the Iranian people. Canada, Norway, the United Kingdom, Israel, France, Sweden, the European Union. We honor and appreciate all of these statements of support for universal human rights. But we must do more. The Iranian regime is cutting off internet access in an attempt to shut down communication among the protesters. They are attempting to silence the voice of the Iranian people. We cannot allow that to happen. Every UN member state is sovereign, but member states cannot use sovereignty as a shield when they categorically deny their people human rights and fundamental freedoms. I call on all of my colleagues to join me in amplifying the message of the Iranian people, and I call on the government of Iran to stop censoring the voice of the people and to restore the access to the internet. Because in the end, the Iranian people will determine their own destiny. And let there be no doubt whatsoever, the The United States stands unapologetically with those in Iran who seek freedom for themselves, prosperity for their families, and dignity for their nation. We will not be quiet. No dishonest attempt to call the protesters puppets of foreign powers will change that. The Iranian people know the truth, and we know the truth. They are acting of their own will, on their own behalf, for their own future. Nothing will stop Americans from standing in solidarity with them. In 2009, the world stood by passively while the hopes of the Iranian people were crushed by their government. In 2018, we will not be silent. Once again, the people of Iran are rising up. They are asking for something that no government can legitimately deny them: their human rights and fundamental freedoms. They are calling out, "Think of us." If the founding principles of this institution mean anything, we will not only hear their cry, we will finally answer it. The Iranian regime is now on notice. The world will be watching what you do. Thank you.
I thank Representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to Representative of France.
Monsieur le
President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Taibrouk Zerihoun for the very specific briefing elements that he shared with us on recent events in Iran. We are keeping a close eye on the situation on the ground, and I would like, on behalf of France, to share with you two main messages this afternoon. Firstly, we have met together this afternoon on the situation in the Middle East, and more specifically on the question of Iran. As everyone knows, within the Security Council, there are several agenda items that allow us to discuss and deal with the various matters relating to international peace and security in the Middle East region, whether that be the implementation of Resolution 2231 or discussions and actions pertaining to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, or Iraq. In this context, our role, indeed our responsibility, is to do all that we can to find a solution to the flashpoints and the crises in the Middle East. And it is in that understanding, President, that we must commit to fully upholding the nuclear agreement with Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, and we must also commit to fully promoting its implementation to the letter. This was the approach that enjoyed consensus during the Council's meeting on the 19th of December last year. Said nuclear agreement with Iran concerns each and every one of us, and the matter at hand is to ensure that it is rigorously implemented. The agreement is one of the cornerstones of stability of the region of the Middle East as a whole. To lose this hard-won ground, to wit the agreement, would be a major setback not just for the region, but also for the entire international community and for the non-proliferation regime, and the consequences and fallout might be very heavy. We must also pursue a realistic and robust dialogue with Iran to regulate its ballistic activity and restrict it in order to ensure that it doesn't pose a risk of further stoking regional instability. We must, moreover, engage in frank and open discussions with Iran so that together with Tehran, we can address the concerns pertaining to Iran's influence over the Middle East and its role in regional crises, more specifically Iran's actions in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. In each of the aforementioned countries, we need to find the ways and means that will allow us to respond to attempts at external meddling. And preventing said external meddling is how we can gauge our attempts at stabilizing said countries. Stability in said countries will stand or fall by preventing said external meddling. This is the only way in which we shall achieve peace and be able to find inclusive political solutions to the conflicts that have buffeted the Middle East over the last few years. Despite our sometimes deep divisions, this dialogue is essential for all of us. Each and every one of us needs to engage in this dialogue, and France intends to engage in this dialogue going forward and not to walk away from it. We will go into it open-eyed and pursue said engagement and dialogue with Iran soberly and honestly. My second point concerns the specific issue that has brought the Council together today. I would like, firstly, to express my alarm in light of the violence with which the recent protests in Iran were met, as well as the number of victims of said violence and the arrests as suffered by the protesters. We call upon the Iranian authorities to exercise restraint and calm. It is essential that fundamental freedoms, such as the freedoms of belief and conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of communication, and the right to peacefully protest, are fully upheld and respected. Iranians should be able to peacefully protest and have their voices and views openly heard. We must be watchful in order to ensure that Iranians' rights and freedoms are not flouted. And this is what President Macron said to his Iranian counterpart, Hassan Rouhani, during their conversation on the 2nd of January. President, it is up to the Iranians and to the Iranians alone to pursue the path of peaceful dialogue, a dialogue based on full respect for the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. However worrying the events of the last few days in Iran may be, they do not constitute, per se, a threat to international peace and security. We must react appropriately to what has been going on. In other words, we must ensure that we remain watchful and that we give proper vigilance to what is happening and to these peaceful protests, and particularly given the risk of violence in response to the protesters. But we must be wary of any attempt to exploit this crisis for personal ends, which would have the diametrically opposed outcome to that which is wished. To conclude, President, change in Iran will not come from without. It will come from the Iranian people themselves. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. First and foremost, given that this is the first open meeting of the Security Council of this month, and indeed of this year, I would like to once again congratulate the Kazakh delegation on behalf of the delegation of the plurinational state of Bolivia. We congratulate you on taking up the reins of the presidency for this month, and we'd like to reassure you of my delegation's full support. President, the Bolivian delegation believes that the holding of this meeting this afternoon is not a good sign. It's not a welcome initiative. And I make that point in the understanding that, as has been the case in the past, we are witnessing a blatant attempt by some missions to bring to the attention of the Security Council issues that do not fall within the purview of this body. We categorically reject the undisguised attempt by some delegations to push for meetings on issues that do not represent threats to international peace and security. In so doing, they run the risk of the Security Council turning into a political tool to be exploited to each member's ends. It needs to be abundantly and crystal clear to the international community that the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran is not an issue that belongs on the agenda of the Security Council. And we are concerned to see that there are clumsy attempts to force its inclusion on the Security Council agenda as part of the broader Middle East agenda item. President, the position of the plurinational state of Bolivia was made abundantly clear by President Evo Morales, who condemned in the strongest possible terms any threat to interfere in or meddle in the internal affairs that would be an affront to the rights and dignity of the people and government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are convinced that, as history has proven time and again, unilateral action, political interventionism, and regime change only ever lead to devastating humanitarian, social, and economic consequences. And we are seeing the repercussions of that still today, including in countries which are before the Security Council. On this particular occasion, we echo what has been said repeatedly in the past by the non-aligned movement, which has time and again reiterated its commitment to respecting the sovereignty, the national unity, and the territorial integrity of states, as well as to upholding the sovereign equality of states, calling for the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of state, as well as the NAM's position on the peaceful solution of disputes and abstaining from the use or threat of use of force. Finally, as a state, Bolivia is convinced that any internal conflict of whichever state or any state around the world must be resolved in the framework of that country's own practices and in line with its own sovereign principles without any external meddling or interference. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of Bolivia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيد الرئيس يطيب لي وأنا أتحدث المرة الأولى.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great pleasure for me, as I speak for the first time in the Security Council, to wish you a Happy New Year and to congratulate you on your presidency of the Council in January. I wish you every success. I would also like to congratulate to the newly elected members of the Council. I wish them every success in the upcoming years. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate that we hope to work together and cooperate with you on all issues on the agenda of the Council. The state of Kuwait will work hard in compliance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter to achieve the aspirations of our peoples and the entire world. We listened carefully to the statement by ASG Taibrook Serihoun, and we appreciate the information he's provided to us and his efforts, as well as the work of the staff members of the Political Affairs Department. We took note of the letter of the 3rd of January of 2018 of the Permanent Representative of Iran to the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the press statement made by the Secretary General on the 3rd of January, in which he expressed his concerns regarding the loss of lives due to the demonstrations in Iran. We have been following the events, and we regret the loss of life among civilians and members of the security forces, as well as the various acts of violence that have occurred in Iran over the past few days. We insist that it's important to respect the right of expression and the rights of peaceful demonstrators in accordance with their constitution and the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights of 1966 that guarantees a freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. It's important to respect these rights. The state of Kuwait considers that it's important to engage in preventive diplomacy and strengthen the role of the Security Council in order to prevent conflicts and to nip crises in the bud before they degenerate. Of course, on the basis of the principles defined that regulate relations between states and that are founded on the Charter of the United Nations, that is the sovereignty, the non-interference in internal affairs, and the compliance with the remit of the various bodies of the United Nations. The Council, according to Article 24, is the body that is in charge of preserving international security and to dealing with all real threats to security and stability in the world. Now, over the past few years, there have been several cases of demonstrations and popular movements that were peaceful at first, but that became violent, and which led to the loss of lives and damage to infrastructure, and even led to external and foreign interference and undermined the stability of the region. Some of these events have led to disastrous results, and the international community is still trying to draw the lessons from these events. We hope that this will not happen in Iran or in any other state. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a neighbor of ours. We have long-standing historic relations with Iran, and we certainly are are keen on maintaining friendly relations based on sovereignty, non-interference, and we have asserted this in the framework of the Gulf Council and also the various Islamic bodies, and we'd like to convey their concerns to you as well. The stability and security of Iran is linked to the stability and security of the region as a whole and of the world as a whole. And this means restraint. Demonstrators must show restraint so there are no more victims. I think, of course, steps must be taken to avoid escalation and violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome to the hot seat. And thank you to our briefer, Assistant Secretary General Zerahun, for the updates on the situation in Iran, and a very warm welcome to all the new members of the Security Council. We look forward to working closely with all 6 of you to enhance international peace and security. The United Kingdom is watching events in Iran very closely. We regret the loss of life that has occurred during the protests. We call for an end to the violence and for the government of Iran to comply with its international human rights obligations in dealing with these protests. There needs to be a meaningful debate about the legitimate and important issues that the protesters are raising. I note here that President Rouhani has said that the protesters' concerns are legitimate and that they have a right to peaceful protest. People should be able to exercise their right to freedom of expression and demonstrate peacefully and lawfully. We encourage the Iranian authorities to permit this. No one is forcing Iran onto our agenda. The Security Council is perfectly empowered through Article 34 of the UN Charter, and I quote, to investigate any dispute or any situation which might lead to international friction or give rise to a dispute in order to determine whether the continuance of the dispute or situation is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. The United Kingdom's concerns about the human rights situation in Iran extend beyond the recent treatment of protesters. The continued use of the death penalty, including for juveniles, weak rule of law, restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of religion, belief, are all deeply worrying. We call on Iran to adhere to its international obligations to respect the rights of individuals to freedom of expression, opinion, and peaceful assembly. We also urge Iran to permit full access to the Special Rapporteur so she can fully assess Iran's actions on areas of concern. At the same time, Mr. President, it is important to recognize that Iran has legitimate security interests in the region. Iran suffered hugely in the Iran-Iraq war. We worked with Iran after 9/11. The Iranian people represent an ancient and important civilization that has a rightful place in the modern world with a modern economy. But too often, Iran's security interests are pursued in a way that destabilizes and at times directly threatens others, supports terrorism, and distorts the Iranian economy. These regional activities risk increasing international conflict and threaten international peace and security. We are deeply concerned by Iranian assistance to groups in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. This includes reported transfers of Iranian ballistic missile parts and related technology to the Houthis in Yemen. Such transfers violate our Resolution 2231, which prohibits such transfers without the authorization of the Security Council. They also violate our Resolution 2216, which prohibits the sale or transfer of arms and related material to the Houthis. Houthi missile attacks in November and December targeted civilian areas. Had they landed as intended, they would have caused suffering and chaos. And there are press reports even today of a new launch. This is unacceptable. We call on all member states to implement UN Security Council resolutions and prevent such attacks, which increase regional tensions and threaten peace and security. The transfer of weapons to the Houthis will also prolong the conflict in Yemen and the suffering of the Yemeni people. As I have said previously, it is essential that the UN conducts a thorough investigation and informs the Security Council of its conclusions as soon as possible. We strongly support the Secretary-General's call for a joint meeting of the 2140 Committee and the 2231 format. We look forward also to the Yemen Panel of Experts report this month. Mr. President, the United Kingdom remains fully committed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It is one of the international community's greatest successes in recent memory. We welcome Iran's compliance with its nuclear commitments. We encourage all member states to uphold their commitments so the Iranian people see the tangible benefits of this deal. We also encourage Iran to uphold its commitments, especially with respect to the provisions of Annex B, as highlighted in the Secretary-General's fourth report, as stipulated by Security Council Resolution 2231. Iran continues to invest heavily in ballistic missile development, despite UN sanctions. We saw launches of ballistic missiles in 2016 and 2017 that were inconsistent with the resolution. We urge Iran to refrain from such activity and ask all partners to report any evidence that Iran is conducting activity inconsistent with Resolution 2231 to the UN Security Council. In conclusion, Mr. President, let us not forget, a prosperous, stable Iran is beneficial to us all, in the region and beyond. We will continue to encourage Iran to comply fully with Security Council resolutions, to respect their citizens' human rights, and to reduce regional tensions. This is the only way to achieve the peace and stability we all endeavour to achieve. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Peru.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is our first statement, having become a non-permanent member of the Security Council. We'd like to thank the delegation of Kazakhstan for its presidency in January. As we come back to the Security Council for the fifth time, I would like to remember Ambassador Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who represented Peru in 1973 and 1974 in this body. At that time, he said that, and I quote, "My delegation will bring here its small store of experience in the United Nations and will strive in fulfilling its mandate to examine with conviction and seriousness the issues that it on the agenda in the spirit of making a carefully considered and calm contribution in dealing with these. We intend to act in the framework of the criteria set out in the spirit and the letter of the charter of the organization." End of quote. Peru would like to reiterate these comments by Ambassador Pérez de Cuellar. Peru would like to thank the Secretary General ASG Tareq Serihun for the briefing regarding the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. On this point, first of all, we regret the loss of life, and we recall that I'd like to remind you that freedom of expression and assembly are inalienable rights. And we'd like to underscore that the Iranian authorities are duty-bound to protect any individual and to guarantee their peaceful exercise of their rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, from the point of view of international peace and security, we would like to take this opportunity to make 3 points. First of all, we believe that the Security Council, which is the main body for maintaining international peace and security, should always be able to contribute to preventing conflicts. This is in line with the Charter of the United Nations. The situation that Iran is experiencing, Iran is a particularly important country for stability in the Middle East, could always escalate and become worse. Similar situations in other countries in the region have had serious consequences recently. Secondly, Peru believes that to be credible, coherent, and effective, the action of the Security Council should be based on the unanimous consensus of its member states, based on a rigorous, objective, and cool-headed analysis of the facts. The Security Council demonstrated this kind of rigorous approach precisely in dealing with the nuclear issue of Iran. Its meaningful efforts were essential, including imposing severe sanctions were essential in achieving the JCPOA. My country considers that compliance with this agreement, endorsed and monitored by the Council, is essential to preserve the non-proliferation regime. It's also reflected in the fact that it is included on the agenda of the Council as a separate item. For Peru, preserving the non-proliferation regime is a top priority, and we'd like to underscore the need for the Security Council to maintain its unity in dealing with issues related to Iran. Along these lines, we'd like to underscore the importance of strengthening multilateralism, cooperation, and international law in order to tackle the serious challenges that the international community faces. Third point. We note that the situation unfolding in Iran also reflects the need to deal with the deep-rooted causes of conflicts that are long-standing and that are regional in nature. These causes point to the clear link between international peace and security, development, and human rights. This implies, inter alia, full respect for international law and full respect for fundamental freedoms and rights. Also, it means confidence and de-escalation measures. It implies credible processes of dialogue and negotiations, greater participation of women and young people in respect of national processes, disarmament, investment in sustainable development, non-interference in internal affairs, prevention of the risks of natural disasters, as well as urgent attention to humanitarian crises, and also, obviously, political support and cooperation of the international community. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Peru for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me to start by congratulating you to the presidency and welcome the new members of the Council, and also thank Assistant Secretary General Tayyip Ruksarian for your briefing. Mr. President, we have closely followed recent developments in Iran. We condemn the excessive use of violence and the deplorable loss of lives. The Security Council has an essential preventive function, and we should constantly consider means to follow up on early warnings in the most suitable and constructive manner, no matter what country is affected or which situation is involved. We do, however, have our reservations on the format and timing of this meeting. Mr. President, for Sweden and the European Union, human rights have always been a core issue in our relations with Iran. Sweden unequivocally supports respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law everywhere around the world. The human right to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression must be respected. This must be the case in Iran, as in any other country. The grievances aired in the protests should be listened to, and the issues raised ought to be resolved through dialogue as part of a democratic process. Mr. President, we have noted President Rouhani's reaffirmation of the people's right to protest peacefully. We expect the Iranian authorities to respond to protests in full compliance with Iran's obligations under international human rights law. Mr. President, in this regard, continued and close dialogue with Iran is of utmost importance. Sweden has been in contact with the Iranian authorities on recent developments. And in the spirit of frankness and respect, we have made clear that we expect all concerned to refrain from the excessive and disappropriate use of force and to ensure and respect freedom of expression, including on the Internet. Mr. President, human rights violations in Iran must be separated from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Sweden and the European Union are very clear on our full support for the agreement. Its continued implementation is of crucial importance. The agreement is ensuring the exclusively peaceful nature of the Iranian nuclear program, which contributes to stability in the region and beyond. It significantly contributes to strengthening the global non-proliferation architecture. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and let me first congratulate you for assuming your role as President of the Council, and therefore try to say in the Kazakh language, thank you, Mr. President. Rahmet Durega. Mr. President, this is the first time the Kingdom of the Netherlands takes the floor as a member of the Security Council for the year 2018. Let me therefore start by thanking my colleague Sebastiano Cardi and his DPR Inigo Lambertini and their team for the excellent work done in 2017 by Italy in the context of our split-term 2017-2018 on this Council. Let me also thank Assistant Secretary General Zerihun for his briefing. And given the value we attach to dialogue, we welcome the presence of Iran in the session today. In my intervention, I will address three issues: the current situation in Iran, human rights, and prevention. Let me start with my first point, the current situation in Iran. As the ASG just mentioned, the anti-government protests in Iran that originated in Mashhad spread to dozens of Iranian cities and rural areas. These were legitimate and peaceful protests by the Iranian people against the social and economic conditions they face in their daily lives. We have witnessed a disturbing level of violence and a death toll that has risen to more than 20, with many more wounded and arrested. And as the ASG just indicated, the situation in Iran now seems to be calming down. And we hope the situation in Iran further stabilizes, especially when it comes to the use of violence. And we therefore call on all sides to refrain from any more violence. We furthermore call upon the Iranian government to launch a comprehensive accountability process. This accountability process should address all cases of serious human rights violations, including those involving the Iranian judiciary and security agencies. An end to impunity for such human rights violations is paramount. Mr. President, this brings me to my second point, respect for human rights. The right to peaceful demonstration and the right to freedom of expression and assembly are fundamental rights. They apply to all persons, in all countries, and Iran is no exception. This was also stressed by the EU and its member states in our recent statement of January the 2nd. In this light, we appreciate the public statements of the Iranian president regarding the legitimacy of peaceful protest in the country. And we take note of the increased willingness for engagement by the Iranian authorities on issues related to human rights. However, we have seen that the Islamic Republic of Iran imposed both offline and online restrictions on the right to freedom of expression, opinion, association, and peaceful assembly. And the Kingdom of the Netherlands urges the Islamic Republic of Iran to end these restrictions, both offline and online. Mr. President, my third point on prevention. Without human rights and without fundamental freedoms, there can be no human dignity. And without human dignity, there can be no lasting stability or security. So, from the perspective of conflict prevention, this Council has a responsibility to act early and decisively when fundamental freedoms are under threat. Every person has the right to individual freedoms, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. And every person has electoral rights and a right to a fair trial. These are not just words. They are obligations under international law. And all governments have a responsibility to honor those obligations. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands reiterates its concern about recent developments in Iran. And we hope that today's session can work as a preventive measure to avoid further escalation of violence. We call upon the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran to exercise restraint when reacting to people exercising their human rights, to lift restrictions on fundamental freedoms, and to uphold the rule of law by holding perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. Dialogue is crucial in this context. Dialogue within Iran to address existing grievances, but also dialogue between Iran and the broader international community. And the Kingdom of the Netherlands is committed to play its role in such a dialogue, especially during our year in this Council. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kingdom of Netherlands for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the beginning, I would like to congratulate you for assuming the presidency. Poland is ready to support you, but we are also very privileged to join the Security Council with new elected members and ready for very close cooperation. I would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Tayebruk Zirhun, for a very useful presentation. Now, allow me to refer to a few points. Poland has been following recent developments in Iran with great attention. We are deeply concerned with the tragic loss of human lives. All sides should unconditionally avoid violence and exercise maximum restraint. We also wish to emphasize that the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as the right to peaceful assembly and demonstrations, and the freedom of opinion and expression, must be protected and respected in line with the international human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the Islamic Republic of Iran is a party to. Iran has a dynamic society with a young, vibrant component that wants to be heard. Based on our historic experience, Poland encouraged all sides, and only Iranians can to engage in a peaceful dialogue as the best way to address the challenges faced by the Iranian society. Poland would like also to take this opportunity to express its concerns with the growing tensions in the region. Iran has the potential to play a constructive role and contribute to the regional stability and security. Therefore, we invite Iranian authorities and other countries in the region to work towards de-escalation of tensions and to avoid actions which may contribute to violence, sectarianism, and polarization. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, since this is the first time that we're taking the floor in this council, I would like to wish everyone here a Happy New Year. I would also like to congratulate you for taking up the presidency of our council for the month of January. Mr. President, with your permission, I would like to thank and commend the outgoing members of the Council, particularly those from the African continent, for their support, their assistance in helping us prepare for the Council, for our seat in the Council. Mr. President, my delegation would like to thank you for having convened this meeting. We would also like to thank Mr. Zerihun, Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, for his briefing on the situation in Iran. My delegation takes note of this briefing, which gives us an overview of the latest developments of the socio-political situation in Iran. Our delegation welcomes that, according to the latest reports that we have, there has been a positive trend and a progressive return to calm on the ground. And we hope that this trend will continue, obviously, as it serves the interests of the Iranian people. Now, we have always been faithful to our policy of dialogue in crisis situations, and hence Côte d'Ivoire calls on the parties involved, in particular the government and the demonstrators, to continue down this path of dialogue in order to reach a peaceful solution of the problems that caused the current situation. To conclude, my delegation hopes that every effort will be made by the Iranian authorities to restore calm among the people, among the Iranian people, in order to be able to continue in a spirit of dialogue and cooperation the necessary economic reforms that should lead to the development of the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Señor Presidente.
President, at the outset, I would like to wish all those present a very happy New Year, in the hope that 2018 will bring us all health, prosperity, and success and wisdom in our endeavours. I would like to add a special word of congratulation to Kazakhstan, via your good self, President of the Security Council, Ambassador Kairat, for having taken up the reins of the presidency of the Security Council for this month of January. And I'd particularly like to congratulate you for the very dynamic programme of work that you have set before the Security Council. President, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea feels very honoured to take its seat for the first time in the Council chamber of the Security Council. And we would like to take this opportunity, as we take up that seat for the first time, to thank most sincerely and most warmly all the member states of the United Nations for the trust that they have reposed in my country. We would particularly like to express our gratitude to all the members of the Security Council, both the current membership as well as those to whom we have just bid farewell, to wit Japan, Senegal, Egypt, Ukraine, Italy and Uruguay, for the invaluable and welcome support that they have extended to us over the last few months preparatory to taking up our seat. I would like to convey similar gratitude to all the staff in the Department of Political Affairs in the Secretariat, and I would particularly like to thank those in the Security Council Affairs Division for all the help that they have made so readily available to us. President, the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the item before us today, refers to the protests and demonstrations that have been taking place in various cities in that country. The government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea does duly recognise the right to protest of citizens, and also would point out that said right is provided for in Iran's own legal system. That said, we underscore that said protests must be peaceful and people-led, and must be duly regulated by the law at all stages, i.e. when being called for, whilst underway, and when demonstrations and protests conclude. And as demonstrations are underway, there must be full respect for the rights of those who choose not to participate in said protests. The human rights situation in Iran is not on the agenda of the Security Council, given that said human rights situation in principle does not constitute a threat to international peace and security. Matters related to human rights must be discussed and dealt with, as in point of fact they have been recently, in the relevant forums as established by the United Nations. In other words, the Human Rights Council and the Third Committee of the General Assembly, as appropriate. And in all such discussions, there must be full respect for the principle as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, that of non-interference in the internal affairs of states. The Republic of Equatorial Guinea bears the conviction that any dispute that arises must be resolved through an unflagging quest for a peaceful solution that can be arrived at through consultation and dialogue, bound at all times by the principles of international law and commensurate with absolute respect for and upholding of human rights. Equatorial Guinea, therefore, believes that frank and inclusive dialogue is the only way in which the current situation in Iran can be resolved. And in that understanding, we believe that the Iranians themselves should be capable of and entrusted with finding solutions to their own problems as brothers and sisters, making use of their democratically elected legitimate institutions with scrupulous respect for the rule of law. Finally, President, we would like to express our gratitude for the briefing that we have heard from the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, Mr. Zerihun. In said briefing, Mr. Zerihun provided us with updated information about the situation in Iran and the course of the protests in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we are heartened to hear from the ASG that these protests and demonstrations are calming down, and we would like to express our hope, therefore, that the next step will be intra-Iranian dialogue so that Iran can domestically resolve the situation that is currently before said country. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish, first of all, to say how pleased I am to see you take the responsibility of the presidency of the Council. I know we can count on your wisdom. Let me also welcome the new members of the Council and assure them of our readiness to work with them closely, as we did with those colleagues who left us having completed their terms. We applaud the contribution they made. I would like to thank ASG Taye Zerihun for his very factual report on the issue we're addressing today. We have also taken note of what the Secretary General said in his statement released 2 days ago. I would like to refer in all humility to a few points in connection with the latest development in Iran. Now, we have no reason to contest the argument that raising human rights issues have no relevance here. What we have doubt about is whether the Security Council is the proper forum for this. The debate on this matter is something which has not been settled yet. What we find a little troubling is that this might not enhance the possibility of achieving the unity of the Council at a time when such unity is so critical. We are not saying this without meaning it. We attach great importance to the issue. No doubt, we are at a very difficult and complex period in world history when there are so many issues that call for greater cooperation among nations, particularly among members of the Council. The Middle East is one of those areas where there is greater need for taking advantage of whatever opportunities we have for diplomacy to work. All countries have responsibility to contribute to the realization of this objective. Iran also has great responsibility in this regard, as do others, as also we do in our own region. We don't want to sound self-righteous, but we seriously believe that everything should be done to ensure that Iran contributes to regional peace and stability. This is very critical for the developing world and Africa, who have had great hope that there will be the right global context for the realization of the 2030 agenda, and for the promise made in 2015 to eradicate extreme poverty. Peace in the Korean Peninsula will contribute to this, as does peace in the Middle East, to which Iran should and could contribute. No doubt the concerns that people have in this regard need to be addressed as frankly as possible, noting that in all this, adherence to principles of international law governing interstate relations is imperative. Let me say, as I conclude, lest I sound again self-righteous, why, as a country, we attach great importance to these principles. It has to do with what had befell us as a country. The only country which was abandoned by the League of Nations when those principles were blatantly abused and we were at the receiving end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, first of all, China congratulates Kazakhstan for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month and welcomes new members of the Security Council. I thank ASG Zerihun for his briefing. Mr. President, today's agenda is the situation of the Middle East. I wish to express China's principal position on this agenda. Recent developments in certain parts of the Middle East are worrying. Some countries are going through wars and conflicts. Hotspot issues are complicated, intertwined, and influence one another. Terrorist forces are rampant and spreading, all of which pose serious challenges on international peace and security. China hopes that countries of the region will work concertedly with the international community to improve the situation in the Middle East as quickly as possible and seek a fundamental solution to achieve regional peace, stability, and development. First, we call for a political solution to the hotspot issues in the region. All sides should play constructive roles and persistently promote dialogue and consultation and reach a sustained solution that takes into account interests of all parties. Second, we should resolutely combat terrorism, persisting uniform standards, and employ all kinds of means to eliminate the root causes that breed terrorism. Third, the purpose and principles of the UN Charter and other basic rules governing that govern international relations should be respected, and independent sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries of the region should be respected. Fourthly, countries of the region should be encouraged to strengthen dialogue, deepen understanding and trust. The Palestinian issue is the core of the Middle East issue. The international community should adhere to the two-state solution and work to restart the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and achieve a comprehensive, just, and sustained solution to the Palestinian issue at an earlier date. The international community should persist in a political solution to the Syrian issue as the main direction, continue to count on the UN as the main channel of mediation, and work towards the comprehensive, just, and careful resolution of the Syrian issue as early as possible. Mr. President, according to the UN Charter, the Council's primary responsibility is maintaining international peace and security. Therefore, the Security Council should not discuss the internal affairs of any country, nor is it the venue for discussing the human rights issue of any country. China takes note of the recent domestic developments of Iran. China hopes and trusts that with the efforts of the Iranian government and people, Iran will remain stable and achieve development. The Iranian situation does not pose any threat on international peace or security, nor is it on the agenda of the Security Council. Discussing the domestic situation of Iran by the Council is a practice that is not in line with the Council's responsibilities as outlined in the UN Charter. Doing so, it does not help resolve the domestic issue of Iran. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President, I would like to congratulate you on taking up your post on the ninth. Would have wanted to congratulate you on the 9th of January during our scheduled first meeting, but the American delegation didn't leave me any option but to congratulate you today, earlier. And this applies to the new members of the council that who I'm happy to see in this room, and I hope to work with them, and I also want to say goodbye to those who have left, who have stepped down from the council. Mr. President, today we're witnessing once again how the United States is abusing the platform of the Security Council. Why is the United States, a permanent member of the Security Council and one of the authors of the UN Charter, undermining the authority of the Security Council as the main body which is responsible for maintaining international peace and security? I mean, I think it is obvious for everyone that the topic chosen today does not fall within the prerogatives established by the UN Charter for the Security Council. And the references we heard today to Article 34 of the UN Charter as applicable to this situation are completely inappropriate. This should be obvious to anyone who will take the time to read Article 34 of the Charter once again. We have often drawn attention to the fact that it is unacceptable to use bogus pretexts to include in the agenda purely internal political issues. Why has the United States chosen to do this today when the domestic situation in Iran has become normalized? And by the way, we should thank Washington for this because to a large extent it's thanks to its dynamic words of encouragement and messages to the Iranian people that we witnessed a consolidation of the Iranian society, and they were united by anti-American feelings. The feeling is that there's some sort of inexplicable allergy to this country and that it clouds the thinking about events in this country and leads to wishful thinking. We obviously regret the loss of lives as a result of demonstrations that weren't so peaceful. However, let Iran deal with its own problems, especially since this is precisely what is taking place. You are dispersing the energy of the Security Council instead of focusing it on dealing with acute crisis situations in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, DPRK, on the African continent. Instead of that, you are proposing that we interfere in the internal affairs of a state. And we don't want to be involved in destabilizing Iran or any other country. Instead of that, let's have a substantive discussion on the issue of the Middle East peace process, including the Palestinian question. If we follow your logic, then we should have meetings of the Security Council after the events in Ferguson and Missouri, or after the dispersal by force of the Occupy Wall Street movement in Manhattan. Or maybe we should propose having a Security Council meeting when a wave of demonstrations occurs in some Western country. Mr. President, we shouldn't look far into history to offer many examples of what short-sighted moves accompanied with interference in internal affairs lead to, or attempts to replace undesirable regimes or impose recipes of democracy. Unfortunately, due to various violations and neglect of the founding principles of the Charter, such as independence and sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful resolution of disputes. Because of that, the situation in many countries of the Middle East that were stable until recently has become horrible. The occupation of Iraq under openly false pretexts, which is still being heavily felt by the people of this country. The gross manipulation of the mandate of the Security Council that led to chaos and destruction in Libya, the methodological incitement and fanning the flames of internecine warfare in Syria, and flirting with terrorists, the war in Yemen, all these open wounds will continue to remind us of the destructiveness of geopolitical engineering and the attempts to determine the fates of other states and nations. However, people prefer not to mention this, not to remember this, and when we remind them of this, they pretend that it doesn't concern them. Sometimes we're asked why we're wary about the concept of the prevention of violent extremism. Well, the approach of the American delegation to what is taking place in Iran is an excellent example to illustrate the substance of our concerns. The source of the problem is declared to be suppression of peaceful protests, the cruelty and undemocratic nature of the regime, and there's a parallel drawn to the events in Syria in 2011. A threat to international peace and security is declared. Thus, the need for external interference is justified in the affairs of Iran. This is precisely the kind of approach that is involved in the notion that is being promoted by the United States of violent extremism. And yet, it is precisely incitement from outside and calls on so-called changes could lead to radicalization and violence, whether it's in Iran or any other country. Mr. President, the real reason for convening today's meeting is not an attempt to protect human rights or promote the interests of the Iranian people, but rather as a veiled attempt to use the current moment to continue to undermine the joint program, the joint plan of action, joint comprehensive plan of action. Similar assessments of the situation were expressed in Berlin and in Paris just yesterday. We consider it unacceptable to intentionally undermine the support of the international community for the JCPOA, which is the main achievement in nuclear non-proliferation over the past few years and in international efforts to ensure international and regional security, especially in a situation where the IAEA has continually confirmed full compliance by Iran with its obligations. Instead of that, the United States has continued to introduce unilateral restrictions that are in breach of international law. And we keep wondering, do you have any other means, diplomatic means, other than sanctions at your disposal? Instead of trying to involve the Security Council in internal affairs and interference in internal affairs, the Council should actually support useful initiatives in establishing regional dialogue on security issues. In the framework of that dialogue, we can find solutions to many issues and concerns. Russia has put forward an initiative on establishing confidence-building measures in the Persian Gulf region. The provision of the Resolution 598 from 1987 continues to be unimplemented. This provision instructs the Secretary General to develop, in consultation with regional parties, security and confidence-building measures. It would be useful to to pay attention to the ideas of the Secretary General to launch a process of political dialogue to resolve existing differences among key countries of the region. Mr. President, we would like to believe that we won't have meetings such as this one under your presidency or in subsequent presidencies, and that the Council will start working on the issues that the UN Charter has defined for it. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Representative of the Russian Federation, for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Kazakhstan. Dear colleagues, I thank ASG Zerihun for his complete and factual briefing. The position of Kazakhstan is very consistent and based entirely on adherence to the norms and principles of international law. The UN Security Council deals with the issues related to the maintenance of international peace and security and respect the sovereignty of other states. We regret the loss of lives in Iran, but Kazakhstan considers the developments in the Islamic Republic of Iran as a domestic issue, which do not fall under the mandate of the UN Security Council, since they do not threaten the international peace and security. We should be very careful, and we reiterate the importance of maintaining global stability worldwide and in the Middle East in particular by reducing violence and preventing the emergence of new tensions. We have too many issues to address already in the same Middle East area. We truly believe that disputes should always be resolved by peaceful means in order to prevent the further escalation of violence and should not inspire extremist forces. We therefore join others in calling on Iran to restore trust and mutual respect within its society, among all social groups involved. We note that the level of tension in Iran has decreased and the situation is gradually normalizing. We hope that this trend will continue, and eventually a peaceful solution will be found based on mutual tolerance and wisdom of the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Despite the recent developments in Iran, they should not undermine the sustainability of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for the Iranian nuclear program. The world community must remain committed to the CPOA, which has been successful and is a factor for regional security. I thank you. Now I resume my function as the President of the Council. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the move by the United States to bring to this Council protests in Iran by some of our citizens for legitimate grievances, some exacerbated by none other than U.S. itself in its dereliction of its obligation under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is an abuse of its power as a permanent member and an abuse of the Council itself. It is unfortunate that despite the resistance on the part of some of its members, this Council has allowed itself to be abused by the current U.S. administration in holding a meeting on an issue that falls outside the scope of its mandate, putting on display the failure of the Council to fulfill its real responsibility in maintaining international peace and security. It is a discredit for the Security Council to take up a matter that is of a pure domestic nature while failing abjectly to lift a finger when it comes to genuine issues, such as the long-lasting occupation of Palestinian territory, to which this item is dedicated, and the indiscriminate bombing of Yemen in the past 3 years, which has so far resulted in the deaths of thousands of human beings, and has brought hunger, disease, and destruction on the Yemeni people. The list of such failures of the Council are all attributable to the obstructionist approach by the U.S. delegation and goes on and on. Mr. President, this is nothing but another desperate attempt by the U.S. administration to escape forward, as it has lost every shred of moral, political, and legal authority and credibility in the eyes of the whole world. Following such acts of disruption taken by this U.S. administration as flouting international law and disrespecting the practices of civilized behavior in international politics, this administration is now desperately reaching for every straw that keeps it afloat. There is a long history of U.S. bullying at the UN, but this is a preposterous example. The purely internal affairs of a nation, in this case, protests that the Iranian government has addressed with the utmost respect for the rights of the protesters and with every attempt to deal with peacefully, despite violent infiltrators and direct encouragement by foreign forces, including by the President of the United States, is not the subject of debate by the world's most important security organ. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, for those who may not remember, also the United States' long history of intervention in the internal affairs of Iran. A continuous pattern of disruption in the course of the democratization process in Iran can be traced back to the coup staged by the U.S. against Iran's democratically elected prime minister in 1953. Hostile acts intensified once Iranians rose up to overthrow their dictator ruler, who was unsurprisingly loved by the U.S. government. Since then, among others, the U.S. has backed attempted military coup and acts of sabotage in Iran, imposed illegal and inhuman unilateral sanctions against ordinary Iranians, unconditionally supported Saddam Hussein in his 8-year destructive war against Iranians, including by providing him with chemical weapons, and even directly engaged in military confrontation with Iran in defense of Saddam. I should also refer to the 290 innocent lives lost, including 66 children, on board Iran Air 655 shot down in July 1988 by the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf. It would be remiss of me not to recall that the U.S. shamelessly decorated the commander who gave the order to fire. Mr. President, while President Trump may be enamored of the fact that no protesters demonstrated against his presence while he was in our neighborhood a few months ago, he may be unaware that they have no right to protest. The fact is that every democratic country, citizens will, from time to time, take to streets to protest one thing or another, and Iran is no exception. In every country, the security forces, be they police, national guards, or others, are present to ensure that protests remain peaceful, and Iran is, again, no exception. However, while the U.S. accuses Iran of suppressing protests, one can only gasp at the hypocrisy when viewing images of Occupy Wall Street protesters beaten and dragged by American policemen. And to go back in time, when National Guardsmen fired on and killed peaceful student protesters at Kent State University, or to watching film of the protests outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. Or more recently, we can review to the 1992 Los Angeles riots over the brutal beating of Rodney King by policemen and killings of innocent African Americans at the hands of law enforcement continue unabated, as we all know. When the California Army National Guards, the 7th Infantry Division, and the 1st Marine Division were called in to restore order. A total of 63 people were killed during the uprising, 2,383 were injured, and more than 12,000 were arrested. I don't recall any member of the UN Security Council calling for debate on this issue when the U.S. military was involved in suppressing domestic unrest. Nor was there debate in 1993 when the FBI raided the Branch Davidian headquarters in Waco, Texas, after a 51-day standoff, killing 83 men, women, and children, the vast majority of whom were entirely innocent of any crime. It was behoove of U.S. ambassador, who perhaps was busy with other priorities at the time of their occurrence, to read up on these travesties of justice on American soil before condemning others for far less. But it is not just the U.S. that has an unenviable record in dealing with protesters. In 2005 in France, then Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy declared a zero-tolerance policy toward protests emanating from the deprived suburbs of Paris and other major French cities, referring to demonstrators, largely poor immigrants, as scum. With almost 3,000 arrests and several deaths, the unrest was only quelled to re-emerge in multiple other forms, more recently in 2017, when the police rape of a young French citizen of African origin once again triggered protests. I do not, however, recall the UN Security Council being summoned for debate on this. And in 2011, in the United Kingdom, the Home Secretary Theresa May utterly condemned the violence amid protests in her country, saying such disregard for public safety and property will not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Prime Minister David Cameron warned rioters, "You will feel the full force of the law, and if you are old enough to commit these crimes, you are old enough to face punishment." In the span of merely a few days, some 3,100 arrests were made, and with the authorities told that they could ignore existing sentencing guidelines, 2 young men who promoted riots via Facebook with the proposed disturbances not attended by any other people were handed 4-year sentences. I do not recall any country bringing any of these reactions to protests across the self-described civilized democracies to the attention of, let alone opening to debate at the United Nations Security Council. Mr. President, we have hard evidence of the violence in Iran by a handful of the protesters, in some cases resulting in the deaths of policemen and security officers, being very clearly directed from abroad. These violent elements surfaced in the crowd as early as Friday evening last week, at the inceptions of the protest. At that point, the hands of elements from outside Iran, including instigators based in the United States and Europe, began to be visible. Incitement to violence included encouraging and training people to use Molotov cocktails, to siege ammunition depots, and to stage an armed uprising. One U.S. resident took to social media to order the killing of 120 members of our security forces, threatening that those who will be included among the killed are their families too, in their homes. This same U.S. resident publicly stated to U.S. media with complete sense of impunity that they should burn down government mosques and police stations. It was clear enough to not just us, but also third parties that Telegram messengers executives decided to block some of the violent inciting channels, citing a line one shouldn't cross. All of this is also well documented in the mainstream media. In one case, a man with extensive criminal record captured a fire engine and ran it over a car, murdering the driver and his 12-year-old son. In some other cases, hooligans got involved and looted shops and banks. Altogether, the peaceful, legitimate protests, which my government emphatically confirmed are a constitutional right which has been respected since the Islamic Revolution, were abused and hijacked to stage vandalism, hooliganism, and in several cases, the firing of weapons. President Trump and some other U.S. politicians have joined ISIS and its patrons in our region to openly incite and encourage violence. It is the ultimate irony that the country whose head of state has thrown his lot in with those visiting violence and destruction on Iran has its UN ambassador, who has a history of belligerent comments on my country, bring it as an issue for debate on the Security Council. If anything, it is Iran that should be demanding a debate and investigation into how and why foreign elements with impunity are allowed to encourage and support unrest and violence in another sovereign and founding member of the United Nations. For example, let's debate why the United States has failed, in spite of repeated official requests, to stop the incitement to violence and murder of innocent civilians from its territory, or why some European countries continue to provide safe haven to terrorists who are inciting violence and armed rioting as we speak, why social media sites that promote and teach the use of Molotov cocktail and boast about people using arms to kill in Iran operate freely in their territory in spite of clear evidence. There are the real issues that need to be addressed. Distinguished members, to make this farce into something more than a mere waste of time, let us discuss something else that this Council has not, but should deal with. The free flow of information has brought with it the spread of fake news and other forms of information war. These threats are common to all free and sovereign nations. We are not alone in finding it necessary to formulate solutions to these challenges. Recently, French President Macron also lauded efforts to increase transparency about the ownership of websites, including their foreign funding, further empowerment of government agencies to fight against any attempt to destabilization by TV station, control or influence by foreign states, and also suggested countering social media channels used as propaganda by introducing laws to disclose the source of funding for particularly sponsored content. These measures are not needed to simply fight back against fake news, rioters, and electoral interference, but more ominously in the fight against terrorists, including ISIS. This fight, distinguished members and colleagues, is not zero-sum. We will either win together or lose together. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.